In the autumn of 1970, while the world watched America plant flags on the lunar surface, the Soviet Union was preparing something different. Not cosmonauts in spacesuits, not boots leaving the first footprints. Something else entirely. A machine, 8 wheels, solar panels spread like wings, a bathtub-shaped body bristling with cameras and instruments. They called it Lunokhod, the Moonwalker. On November 17, 1970, it rolled down a ramp onto the Sea of Rains and became the first remote-controlled rover to touch another world. But this story doesn't start there. It starts years earlier, in the mind of a designer who'd spent his career building machines for war and who would pivot almost overnight to building machines for peace. This is the story of how the Soviet Union built a lunar tank and why, decades later, it remains one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of robotics. This is Blueprint. Part 1. The Engineers. The year is 1963. The Cold War is at its height. America and the Soviet Union are locked in a technological arms race that extends beyond Earth's atmosphere. President Kennedy has promised to put a man on the moon before the decade's end. The Soviets have their own plans, but they're fragmented, competing, often contradictory. Multiple design bureaus vie for resources and prestige. Sergei Korolev, the Soviet Union's chief rocket designer, is racing to develop the N-1 rocket that will carry cosmonauts to the moon. But Korolev is a pragmatist. He knows the American program is well-funded, well-organized, and moving fast. He needs alternatives, backup plans. So in 1963, Korolev reaches out to an organization that seems at first glance to have nothing to do with space exploration, VNII 100. Later, it would be known as the All-Union Scientific Research Institute of Transport Mechanical Engineering. At the time, it was developing ground vehicles, tanks, amphibious carriers, things that rolled through mud and snow and crossed rivers. Korolev's question was simple. Could they build something that would roll across the moon? The man who would answer that question was Alexander Leonovich Kemurdzhian. Born in 1921 in Vladikavkaz, a city in the North Caucasus, Kemurdzhian grew up in the Soviet Union's tumultuous early decades. His childhood was marked by hardship, but also by a fascination with machines. He built things, mechanical toys, small engines. By 1939, he'd set his sights on the Moscow Aviation Institute. He wanted to design aircraft. The war interrupted those plans. Like millions of young Soviet men, Kemurdzhian served during the Great Patriotic War. When he returned, he completed his engineering degree and began working on military vehicles. By the early 1960s, he'd established himself as an expert in mobility. Not just making things move, but making them move in impossible conditions. Swamps, Arctic tundra, loose sand. The Soviet military needed vehicles that could operate where roads didn't exist. Kemurdzhian delivered. When Korolev's request arrived, Kemurdzhian was working on hovercraft, air-cushioned vehicles that could skim across water and ice. It was cutting-edge technology, military-funded, highly classified. The Lunar Rover project must have seemed, at first, almost absurd. The moon had no roads, no atmosphere, no water. Temperatures swung from 120 degrees Celsius in sunlight to minus 170 in shadow. The gravity was 1/6 of Earth's. The soil was an unknown mixture of dust and rock. How do you design a vehicle for a place no human has ever seen up close? But Kemurdzhian didn't say no. He assembled a team. Engineers who understood suspension systems, electric motors, materials, science. They started with basic questions. How many wheels? What kind of treads? How much ground clearance? Every decision had to account for conditions they could only guess at. They studied telescopic images of the lunar surface. They read American papers. They built test rigs and simulators. And they started designing. At the same time, another man was taking on his own impossible task. Georgy Babakhin, chief designer at the Lavochkin Design Bureau. Lavochkin had built fighter planes during World War II, fast, deadly aircraft that tangled with the Luftwaffe over Stalingrad and Berlin. After the war, the Bureau shifted to missiles and jet engines. But by the early 1960s, it was struggling. The founder, Semyon Lavochkin, had died in 1960. The bureau was reorganized, absorbed into Vladimir Chilomi's design empire as branch number 3. It needed a new purpose. That purpose became interplanetary probes, Luna spacecraft, Venera probes to Venus, and eventually the vehicle that would carry Kemurdzhian's rover to the moon. Bабakhin took over in 1965. He was methodical, demanding, known for working through problems with relentless attention to detail. The Luna lander had to do several things perfectly: survive launch, navigate to the moon, enter lunar orbit, descend to the surface without crashing, deploy a ramp, and then sit there, keeping the rover systems warm and powered while it explored. Bабakhin and Kemurdzhian were different men with different backgrounds, but they shared one trait. They solved problems by building things and testing them until they broke. Then they built them again, better. This iterative, hands-on approach would define the Lunokhod program. Part 2, the design. By 1965, the basic outline of the rover was taking shape. It wouldn't be small. Early proposals suggested a vehicle around 900 kilograms. That weight would balloon as systems were added, but the team knew they needed something substantial. The moon wasn't a laboratory floor. It was an alien world, and the rover had to be robust enough to survive the unknown. The chassis came first. Kemurdzhian's team settled on 8 wheels, independently powered and suspended. This wasn't arbitrary. 8 wheels provided redundancy. If one failed, the rover could continue. The suspension system was crucial. The moon's surface was pocked with craters, strewn with rocks, covered in unknown depths of dust. The wheels needed to climb over obstacles without tipping the vehicle. Kemurdzhian's team designed a system where each wheel could move independently, maintaining contact with the ground, even over rough terrain. The wheels themselves were works of engineering art. They weren't pneumatic tires. You can't use air-filled tires in a vacuum. Instead, they were made of metal mesh, woven like a basket, with titanium spokes. The design was flexible enough to absorb shocks, but rigid enough to support the vehicle's weight. Treads were stamped into the mesh to provide traction. Testing showed the wheels could roll over rocks half their diameter without losing grip. Power was another challenge. Solar panels were the obvious choice. The moon had no atmosphere to scatter light, which meant sunlight on the lunar surface was intense and direct, but it also meant the rover could only operate during the lunar day. A lunar day lasts about 14 Earth days, followed by 14 days of darkness. The rover would need to hibernate through the night, conserving battery power, and wake up when the sun returned. The solar panel was mounted on the rover's lid, a large convex cover that could be opened to expose the instruments below or closed to protect them. When closed, the lid acted as a thermal blanket, trapping heat generated by a polonium-210 radioisotope heater. This heater didn't generate electricity. It just produced warmth, enough to keep the electronics from freezing during the lunar night. It was a simple, elegant solution to an otherwise insurmountable problem. The body of the rover was a pressurized compartment, not pressurized like a spaceship. There were no cosmonauts inside, but sealed and filled with an inert gas to regulate temperature and protect sensitive electronics. Inside were the brains of the operation: a computer, radio transceivers, navigational instruments, and the cameras. 4 television cameras were mounted on the rover, providing overlapping views of the terrain ahead and to the sides. A 5th, higher resolution camera could pan and tilt, capturing detailed images of rocks and soil. The instruments were equally sophisticated. A penetrometer could measure the compressive strength of the lunar soil. An X-ray spectrometer analyzed the chemical composition of rocks. A laser reflector allowed scientists on Earth to measure the distance to the moon with unprecedented accuracy, and a cosmic ray detector studied radiation levels. But the most important instrument was the navigation system. The rover was going to be driven remotely from a control room on Earth, but Earth was 384,000 kilometers away. Radio signals took more than a second to travel one way. That meant a round-trip delay of over 2 seconds. You couldn't drive a rover in real time with that kind of lag. By the time you saw an obstacle and reacted, you'd already crashed into it. The solution was a hybrid system. The controllers on Earth sent high-level commands. Move forward, turn left, stop. The rover's onboard computer executed those commands, adjusting for tilt, wheel slippage, and obstacles. The cameras sent back images every few seconds, allowing the controllers to plan the next move. It was slow, agonizingly slow, but it worked. Part 3. The prototype. The first prototype was finished in 1968. It was a test vehicle not meant for flight, but used to validate the design and train the crew. The crew, that's what they called the controllers. 5 men and women who would sit in a control room near Moscow and pilot the rover across the moon. They trained like cosmonauts, learning to interpret grainy television images, to judge distances, to navigate around rocks and craters. They practiced on simulated lunar terrain, driving the prototype through fields of gravel and sand, over ramps and obstacles. The prototype was a learning tool. It revealed problems the designers hadn't anticipated. The wheels, for instance, tended to dig into soft soil under certain conditions. The solution was to adjust the drive algorithms, varying the speed and torque to each wheel. The cameras, mounted low on the body, sometimes had their view blocked by rocks or the rover's own shadow. Additional cameras were repositioned. But the most important lesson from the prototype was operational. Driving a rover on the moon wasn't like driving a car. It required patience, discipline, and teamwork. The crew developed protocols. One person navigated, studying maps and planning routes. Another monitored the rover's systems, battery levels, motor temperatures, wheel currents. A third controlled the cameras, panning and tilting to get the best view. 2 others operated the instruments, taking measurements and coordinating with scientists on Earth. They trained for hundreds of hours. They studied maps of the moon, memorizing craters and ridges. They worked through failure scenarios. What if a wheel motor burned out? What if a camera failed? What if the rover tipped over? For every question, they developed a procedure. Meanwhile, the flight model was being built. This was the rover that would actually go to the moon. Every component was tested to the point of destruction. Motors were run until they failed, then redesigned. Welds were X-rayed, electronics were subjected to thermal cycling, vibration tests, and radiation exposure. Nothing was left to chance. The flight model was designated Ye-8. It was slightly heavier than the prototype, weighing in at around 840 kilograms, not including the lander. The lander, developed by Babakhin's team at Lavochkin, was a marvel in its own right. It was a 4-legged platform equipped with a rocket engine, fuel tanks, and guidance systems. The rover sat on top, folded into its traveling configuration, solar panel closed, wheels tucked in. The lander had 2 ramps, one on each side. This redundancy was critical. If the lander touched down on uneven ground and one ramp was blocked by a boulder or a crater, the rover could deploy the other ramp. The ramps extended automatically after landing, unfolding like drawbridges. Sensors confirmed they were secure, and then the rover, on command from Earth, would roll down onto the surface. But before any of that could happen, they had to get there. The rocket was the Proton K, one of the Soviet Union's most powerful boosters. The Proton was a beast. Fueled by toxic, corrosive hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide, it could lift over 20 tons into low Earth orbit. For lunar missions, an upper stage called the Block D provided the final push to send the spacecraft on a trans-lunar trajectory. Part 4. The failure. The first attempt was in February 1969. The mission was designated Ye-8 number 201. It carried the first lunar rover, later known as Lunokhod 0 or Lunokhod 1A. The Proton rocket lifted off from Baikonur Cosmodrome, Kazakhstan, climbed through the atmosphere, and then 51 seconds into the flight disintegrated. The upper stages broke apart. The payload, including the rover, was destroyed. The failure was traced to a faulty sensor in the rocket's control system. A vibration-induced short circuit had sent erroneous commands to the engines, causing them to gimbal violently. The rocket tore itself apart. The team was devastated. They'd spent years building the rover, testing it, preparing for this moment. it, and in less than a minute it was gone. But there was no time to mourn. The space race was still on. America's Apollo program was advancing rapidly. Apollo 11 was scheduled to land on the moon in July. If the Soviets were going to respond, they had to move quickly. They built another rover, Ye-8 number 203. It was nearly identical to the first, incorporating minor improvements based on lessons learned. The launch was scheduled for November 1969, but the Proton wasn't ready. The investigation into the February failure had taken months, and new safety protocols delayed the launch further. By the time the rocket was cleared for flight, the Apollo program had already succeeded. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had walked on the moon. The race, in some sense, was over, but the Soviet program continued. The goal was no longer to beat America, but to demonstrate a different approach. Cosmonauts on the moon would plant flags and collect rocks. A rover could explore for months, covering more ground, conducting more experiments at a fraction of the cost. It was a pivot, a reframing of the mission, but it was also practical. The Soviet lunar landing program was faltering. The N-1 rocket, the cornerstone of the crewed lunar effort, had failed spectacularly in multiple tests. The rover program offered a way to claim a different kind of victory. Part 5. The Landing. November 10th, 1970. The Proton K rocket stood on the pad at Baikonur, holding Ye-8 number 203 and the Luna 17 lander. The countdown proceeded without incident. The rocket ignited, lifted off, and climbed into the night sky. This time, everything worked. The first stage separated cleanly. The second stage fired. The third stage pushed the spacecraft into orbit. The block D upper stage ignited, sending the spacecraft toward the moon. The translunar coast took 3.5 days. The spacecraft was tracked by ground stations across the Soviet Union. Course corrections were calculated and executed. On November 15th, Luna 17 entered lunar orbit. It circled the moon, adjusting its trajectory, preparing for the descent. The landing site had been chosen carefully. The Sea of Rains, Mare Imbrium, was a flat, relatively smooth plain in the moon's northwestern quadrant. It was far from the Apollo landing sites, a deliberate choice. The Soviets wanted to explore new territory. On November 17th, at 3:47 UTC, the descent engine fired. Luna 17 dropped out of orbit, falling toward the surface. The engine throttled down as the lander's radar measured altitude. At 20 meters, the engine cut off. The lander fell the final distance under lunar gravity, impacting at about 5 meters per second. The legs absorbed the shock. For a moment, there was silence. Then the telemetry came through. Luna 17 was stable. The ramps deployed. The rover was ready. But they didn't drive off immediately. The crew in Moscow needed to assess the situation. They studied the images coming back from the lander's cameras. The ground looked firm. There were no large rocks blocking the ramps. The rover's systems were nominal. They waited for several hours, going through checklists, confirming every detail. Then, finally, the command was sent. Lunokhod 1 rolled down the ramp and onto the lunar surface. It was November 17th, 1970, the first rover on another world. Part 6, the mission. Lunokhod 1 was designed to operate for 90 days. It would far exceed that. For 11 months, it roamed the Sea of Rains, covering more than 10 kilometers. By comparison, it would take NASA's Mars Opportunity rover 6 years to cover the same distance. But Lunokhod wasn't on Mars. It was on the moon, where temperatures swung wildly, where jagged rocks lurked in every shadow, where a single mistake, a miscalculated turn, a wheel caught in a crater could end the mission. The crew worked in shifts. During the lunar day, the rover operated for a few hours at a time. The controllers sent commands. Move forward 50 centimeters, stop, take images, analyze the route, move again. It was painstaking. The 2-second communication delay meant they couldn't react to obstacles in real time. Every move had to be planned, anticipated, thought through. They drove at night too, not during the lunar night, Lunokhod hibernated then, conserving power, but during Earth's night when most people were asleep. The crew worked around the clock. They became intimately familiar with the rover's quirks. Motor 3 ran a little hot. Wheel 6 sometimes slipped on loose soil. The front camera had a dead pixel. They learned to work around these issues, adjusting their driving to compensate. The science was extraordinary. Lunokhod's instruments sent back data on the composition of the lunar soil. The X-ray spectrometer identified elements: silicon, iron, calcium, titanium. The penetrometer measured soil density, revealing that the surface was firmer than some scientists had expected. The cosmic ray detector recorded radiation levels, data that would be crucial for planning future crewed missions. The cameras were perhaps the most valuable instruments. They transmitted more than 20,000 images and over 200 panoramic views. These images revealed a landscape that was alien yet familiar. Hills and valleys, craters within craters, boulders casting sharp shadows in the airless void. The images were grainy, low resolution by modern standards, but they were mesmerizing. They showed a world untouched by wind or water, frozen in time. One of Lunokhod's most important contributions was the laser reflector. This was a panel of corner cube prisms that reflected light directly back to its source. Observatories on Earth could shine a laser at the reflector and measure the time it took for the light to return. This allowed scientists to calculate the distance to the moon with centimeter precision. Over the following decades, these measurements revealed that the moon is gradually drifting away from Earth at about 3.8 centimeters per year. They also provided tests of Einstein's theory of general relativity. But the mission wasn't without challenges. In January 1971, Lunokhod ventured into a crater, hoping to study rocks exposed on the crater wall. The descent was steeper than anticipated. The rover tilted, and for a tense few hours, the crew wasn't sure it would be able to climb back out. They adjusted the wheel speeds, redistributing torque to the wheels with the best traction. Slowly, the rover clawed its way up the slope and back onto level ground. In March, one of the wheels began showing signs of trouble. The motor's temperature spiked during operation. The crew reduced the load on that wheel, relying more on the others. Lunokhod limped on, but the failure was a reminder of how fragile the mission was. Every component was operating at the edge of its design envelope. Any one of 1,000 things could go wrong. Part 7. The end. By September 1971, Lunokhod had far outlasted its design life. It had survived 10 lunar days and nights, each cycle pushing its systems closer to failure. The solar panels were degrading, accumulating dust that reduced their efficiency. The batteries no longer held a full charge. The motors were wearing out. The controllers knew the end was near. On October 4th, 1971, the anniversary of Sputnik, they sent the final commands. Lunokhod parked on a ridge, its cameras pointed toward the Earth. The solar panel was positioned to maximize the reflectivity of the laser retroreflector. Then the signal went silent. The rover was shut down, its mission complete. The official reason given was that the mission objectives had been accomplished. But the truth was simpler. Lunokhod was dying. The polonium heater, which had kept the electronics warm through the lunar nights, was decaying. It had a half-life of 138 days. After 11 months, it was producing a fraction of its original heat. The electronics were starting to fail during the cold nights. Another cycle, and the rover might not wake up. So they ended it on their terms, with Lunokhod still functional, still sending data. It was a controlled conclusion to an extraordinary mission. Part 8. The second rover. The success of Lunokhod 1 led to a second mission, Luna. 21 launched in January 1973, carrying Lunokhod 2. This rover was improved based on lessons from the first. It was slightly faster, capable of speeds up to 2 kilometers per hour. Its cameras had better resolution. Its instruments were more sensitive. Lunokhod 2 landed in Le Monnier crater on the southeastern edge of the Sea of Serenity. This was rougher terrain than the Sea of Rains, chosen deliberately to test the rover's capabilities, and Lunokhod 2 performed brilliantly. In just 4 months, it traveled 37 kilometers, a record that would stand for 40 years until NASA's Opportunity rover surpassed it on Mars. But Lunokhod 2's mission ended abruptly. In May 1973, while driving through a crater, the rover brushed against a slope and disturbed loose soil. Dust and regolith cascaded onto the solar panel. The crew tried to shake it off by tilting the panel and maneuvering the rover, but it was no use. The dust stuck, reducing power generation. The rover's internal temperature began to rise during the lunar day. Without sufficient power to run the cooling system, the electronics overheated. On May 11th, contact was lost. Lunokhod 2 had succumbed to the very environment it was designed to explore. Part 9. The Legacy. After Lunokhod 2, the program ended. A third rover, Lunokhod 3, was built and prepared for launch, but the mission was cancelled. The political will was fading. The Soviet lunar program was winding down. Resources were redirected to space stations and Earth-orbiting satellites. Lunokhod 3 never flew. It sat in storage for decades, eventually ending up in a museum. For years, the Lunokhod program was overshadowed by the Apollo missions. In the West, the rovers were barely mentioned. When people thought about lunar exploration, they thought about astronauts, not robots. But within the scientific community, Lunokhod's achievements were recognized. The rovers had demonstrated that remote exploration was not only possible, but in some ways superior to crewed missions. They operated for months, covered more ground, and did it at a fraction of the cost. The technology developed for Lunokhod influenced later missions. The Mars rovers, Sojourner, Spirit, Opportunity, Curiosity, Perseverance, all traced their lineage back to the principles established by Kemurdzhian's team. The idea of a semi-autonomous rover capable of executing high-level commands while navigating obstacles independently became the standard approach. Kemurdzhian himself continued working on planetary rovers until his death in 2003. He contributed to plans for Mars missions, Venus rovers, and other ambitious projects that never flew. But his legacy is secure. He was the father of planetary rovers, the man who proved it could be done. Georgy Babakhin died in 1971, just months after Lunokhod 1's mission ended. He didn't live to see Lunokhod 2, but his designs continued to fly. The Lavochkin Bureau went on to develop Venera landers, which successfully touched down on Venus and sent back the only images we have from that hellish surface. In 2010, nearly 40 years after it went silent, Lunokhod 1 was found. A team of scientists used images from NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter to pinpoint the rover's location. They aimed a laser at the coordinates and, to their amazement, received a reflection. The retro reflector was still working. Lunokhod 1 was still there, frozen in time, exactly where the controllers had parked it. The discovery allowed scientists to continue using the reflector for laser ranging experiments. The data contributed to ongoing studies of the moon's orbit and tests of general relativity. In a sense, Lunokhod 1's mission never ended. It's still working, still contributing to science 5 decades after it rolled across the Sea of Rains. Part 10. The Forgotten Masterpiece. So why is Lunokhod not better known? Part of it is timing. The rovers flew during the height of the Cold War, and their achievements were reported with skepticism in the West. Soviet space successes were often downplayed or dismissed as propaganda. Part of it is the nature of the missions. Robots don't capture the imagination the way humans do. There were no dramatic moments, no one small step for man speeches, just a machine rolling slowly across a barren plain. But another reason is that the Soviet Union itself didn't fully appreciate what it had accomplished. The lunar program was seen as a failure. The goal had been to land cosmonauts on the moon, and that never happened. Lunokhod was a consolation prize, a way to save face after losing the race. The engineers who built the rovers knew better. They knew they'd created something remarkable. But in the official narrative, Lunokhod was a footnote. It's only in recent years, as the full history of the Soviet space program has been declassified and studied, that Lunokhod's true significance has emerged. It was a technological marvel, a triumph of engineering, and a proof of concept for an entirely new way of exploring other worlds. The rovers demonstrated that you didn't need to send humans to conduct meaningful science. You could send machines, controlled remotely, capable of operating for months in the harshest environments imaginable. This wasn't just about the moon. The principles developed for Lunokhod would apply to Mars, to Europa, to Titan. Anywhere humans couldn't easily go, rovers could. And in the decades since Lunokhod, that vision has been realized. Rovers have explored Mars, revealing a planet that was once warm and wet, possibly hospitable to life. They have drilled into rocks, analyzed soil, and driven hundreds of kilometers across alien deserts. All of it traces back to a team of Soviet engineers in the 1960s, working in secret, building a machine they called a moonwalker. They didn't have the resources of the American program. They didn't have unlimited budgets or access to the latest technology. They had ingenuity, determination, and a willingness to try something no one had done before. Alexander Kemurdzhian used to say that designing for the moon was like designing for nowhere. There were no roads, no maps, no points of reference. Everything had to be figured out from first principles. How do you build a wheel that works in 1/6 gravity? How do you navigate without GPS? How do you keep electronics alive in temperatures that swing 300 degrees? Every question led to another question, and the answers had to be found through experimentation, through building and testing, and sometimes failing. The Lunokhod program was, in many ways, a series of failures that led to success. The first rover exploded on the launch pad. The second succeeded beyond all expectations. The third was cut short by an accident. And the fourth never flew. But what they accomplished in those few missions changed the course of space exploration. Today, if you look up at the moon on a clear night, you can see the Sea of Rains. It's one of the dark patches on the lunar surface, visible to the naked eye. Somewhere in that vast plain, Lunokhod 1 sits silently, its wheels locked in place, its cameras dark, its solar panels coated in dust. But its reflector still works, still bounces laser light back to Earth, still contributes to our understanding of the cosmos. It's a monument to human ingenuity, a reminder that exploration isn't just about planting flags or leaving footprints. It's about asking questions and finding answers. It's about building machines that can go where we can't, see what we haven't, and tell us what they find. Lunokhod was called a moon tank, and in some ways, that's accurate. It was built tough, designed to survive a hostile environment, armed not with weapons, but with instruments. It rolled into the unknown and came back with knowledge. And in doing so, it proved that the future of space exploration wasn't just humans or robots. It was both working together, each doing what they do best. The Lunokhod program ended in 1973, but its legacy continues. Every time a rover drives across the surface of Mars, every time scientists propose a mission to Europa or Enceladus, they're building on what Kemurdzhian and his team started. The Soviet moon tank that never became famous, that was overshadowed by Apollo, that was forgotten for decades, was actually one of the most important machines ever built, because it showed us that we could explore not just with our feet, but with our minds. Not just with our eyes, but with cameras and sensors and instruments that extend our senses beyond what biology allows. Lunokhod was the first step on a journey that continues today and will continue for as long as humans look up at the stars and wonder what's out there. In the end, Lunokhod didn't need to beat Apollo. It didn't need parades or headlines. It just needed to work, and it did. For 11 months, it roamed the moon, sending back data and images, exploring a world no human had ever walked. It was a machine, yes, but it was also a testament to what humans can achieve when they refuse to accept the impossible. The Soviet moon tank touched the moon in ways that went far beyond physical contact. It touched our understanding of what's possible. It touched the future of exploration, and it touched the imagination of everyone who believes that the greatest adventures aren't behind us, but ahead, waiting to be discovered. That's the story of Lunokhod, a forgotten masterpiece, a Cold War relic, a robot that changed everything.